Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.50, The Fall of Israel. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I left King Ahaz of Judah in dire straits. His kingdom was being raided by Edomites and Philistines. The kingdoms of Israel and Aram-Damascus were demanding that he join them against Assyria. When Ahaz said that he already had enough problems to cope with, Kings Pekah of Israel and Winston of Aram-Damascus moved against him in an attempt to stabilize their flanks. The Israelites and Arameans were initially successful. Chronicles records them killing 120,000 Judeans in a single day, and taking a further 120,000 captive. The numbers are ridiculous, but ridiculous numbers are commonplace in military accounts even in our own day. The prophet Isaiah encouraged Ahaz to rely on God to protect sacred Jerusalem. Quote, Isaiah 7:3. Yahweh said to Isaiah, "Go out with your son to meet Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, by the road of the fuller's field, and say to him, Be firm and be calm. Do not be afraid, and do not lose heart on account of those two smoking stubs of firebrands, on account of the raging of Winston and his Arameans, and Pekah of Israel." End quote. Over his long career, Isaiah would give foreign policy advice to quite a few Judean monarchs. He was the Henry Kissinger of his day. He had two firm policy positions. First, trust in God alone. The prophet was certain that the Assyrians were God's instrument of justice against Israel, and that attempts to thwart them defied God's will. It was therefore a sin to ally with Pekah of Israel against the Assyrians. Quote, Isaiah 10:5. Ah, Assyria, the rod of my anger, the club in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. When Yahweh has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the arrogant boasting of the king of Assyria and his haughty pride. End quote. The Assyrians have no say in their role as pawns in God's plan. They will be punished in the future, but not for their bellicosity, but for their hubris. So, allying with the Assyrians is a good idea, right? No. Isaiah's second policy was, do not put your faith in alliances with foreigners. God will protect Judah, so why bother? Isaiah was convinced that Jerusalem could never fall to a foreign army. The city was under God's protection. Quote, Isaiah 37:33. Assuredly, thus said Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not enter this city, he shall not shoot an arrow at it, or advance upon it with a shield, or pile up a siege mound against it. He shall go back by the way he came. He shall not enter this city, declares Yahweh. I will protect and save this city for my sake, and for the sake of my servant David. End quote. Ahaz was more than dubious. Against the prophet Isaiah's advice, Ahaz called upon the Assyrians for aid. According to Assyrian records, the year was 733 BC. The Assyrians were only too happy to help out a new friend, Judah, against Israel and Aram-Damascus. Quote, 2 Kings 16:7. Ahaz sent messengers to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria to say, I am your servant and your son, Come and deliver me from the hands of those who are attacking me. Ahaz took the gold and silver that were on hand in the house of the Lord, and in the treasuries of the royal palace, and sent them as a gift to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria responded to his request. The king of Assyria marched against Damascus and captured it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put King Rezin to death." End quote. Again, the treasures of the temple were despoiled. But that was a small price to pay for national survival. The Assyrians had neutralized Judah's greatest threats, Israel and Aram-Damascus. After Tiglath-Pileser III withdrew from the field, Aram-Damascus was in ruins. Israel had survived, but with the loss of half its territory. Galilee and Naphtali in the north, and the tribal lands of Reuben, Manasseh and Gad, east of the Jordan. Only the southern hill country around the capital of Samaria was left. Just to show he was serious, Tiglath-Pileser deported a few thousand Israelites to Assyria. The Jewish diaspora had begun. Ahaz had taken a gamble and won. He had decided that the Assyrian economy provided more benefits than its military posed a threat. He was right. His small kingdom joined the Walmart supply chain of its era. The archaeology shows that the Beersheba Valley, in the south of Judah, transformed from a sparsely settled fringe area to a densely occupied industrial region. I'm not talking steam engines here, but olive presses. Okay? Ahaz had saved his kingdom. The biblical authors give him no credit. He gets another bum rap for building an Assyrian altar. The Book of Kings refrains from noting that the Temple of Jerusalem itself was designed and built by the Phoenician king Hiram. Quote, 2 Kings 16:10. When King Ahaz went to Damascus to greet King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, he saw the altar in Damascus. King Ahaz sent the priest Uriah a sketch of the altar and a detailed plan of its construction. The priest Uriah built the altar before King Ahaz returned from Damascus. When the king returned from Damascus, and when the king saw the altar, the king drew near the altar, ascended it, and offered his burnt offering and meal offering. He poured his libation, and he dashed the blood of his offering of well-being against the altar. End quote. 16 years after he had followed his father Jotam onto the throne of Judah, Ahaz passed away peacefully in the bosom of the Pax Assyriana in 728 BC. Now, some scholars dispute that date by as much as 15 years. Around the time that Ahaz of Judah died, his old enemy Pekah of Israel met his own more violent fate. According to Kings, Pekah was overthrown by Hoshea, son of Elah. The Assyrians said that Pekah was overthrown by the whole people. Hoshea was a faithful Assyrian vassal in his early years, paying the annual tribute his masters demanded. 5 years after his accession, Hoshea decided enough was enough. Hoshea was emboldened to join yet another anti-Assyrian coalition. This time the alliance was supported by Egypt. What could possibly go wrong? Exactly at this point Assyrian records fail us. We know that 2 Assyrian kings moved to suppress the upstart Israelites. Shalmaneser V and his brother and usurper Sargon II. Sargon did his best to eliminate all the records of his brother's reign. Thanks for that, Sargon. Perhaps Hoshea revolted and initially faced Shalmaneser V. Then when Sargon II launched a coup against his brother, Hoshea took the opportunity to approach the Egyptians, hoping the Assyrians wouldn't find out. They did find out. To Hoshea's surprise, Sargon II sorted out his problems with alacrity. The Assyrian quickly stormed back to the Levant with vengeance on his mind. Quote, 2 Kings 17:4. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in an act of treachery. He had sent envoys to King So of Egypt, and he had not paid the tribute to the king of Assyria, as in previous years. And the king of Assyria arrested him and put him in prison. Then the king of Assyria marched against the whole land. He came to Assyria and besieged it for 3 years. End quote. Sargon II put it like this, quote, a commoner without claim to the throne, a cursed Hittite, schemed to become king of Hamath, and persuaded the cities of Arvad, Simirah, Damascus, and Samaria to desert me. I called up the masses of the soldiers of Asher and besieged him. I conquered and burnt his city. He I flayed. The rebels I killed in their own cities. I crushed the tribes of the Arabs who live far away in the desert and who knew neither overseers nor officials and who had not brought tribute before to any king. And I deported their survivors and settled them in Samaria. End quote. The Assyrians laboured for 3 years to capture Hoshea's capital of Samaria, a testament to King Omri's wise selection of the site 150 years before. But fall it did to King Sargon II in 722 BC. The region was reorganized as an Assyrian province under an Assyrian governor. The Book of Kings has no doubt why. Quote, 2 Kings 17:7. This happened because the Israelites sinned against Yahweh Elohim, who had freed them from the land of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the customs of the nations which the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and the customs which the kings of Israel had practiced. The Israelites committed against Yahweh Elohim acts which were not right. They built for themselves shrines in all their settlements. They set up pillars and sacred posts for themselves on every lofty hill and under every leafy tree. And they offered sacrifices there at all the shrines, like the nations whom the Lord had driven into exile before them. They committed wicked acts to vex Yahweh, and they worshipped fetishes, concerning which Yahweh had said to them, "You must not do this thing." End quote. Just to put the boot in, Kings traces these evils back to the very founder of the kingdom, Jeroboam, 2 centuries and 17 kings earlier. Quote, 2 Kings 17:21. For Israel broke away from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam king. Jeroboam caused Israel to stray from the Lord and to commit great sin. And the Israelites persisted in all the sins which Jeroboam had committed. In the end, Yahweh removed Israel from his presence, as he had warned them through all his servants the prophets. So the Israelites were deported from their land to Assyria, as is still the case. End quote. How many Israelites did the Assyrians deport? The traditional position is that the nation of Israel, the famous 10 lost tribes, disappeared into history, and that the Levant was filled with thousands of refugees marching under the Assyrian whip to settle in lands amid the ruins of earlier Assyrian conquests. The Book of Kings is insistent that only a few survivors remained, survivors who were quickly corrupted. Quote, 2 Kings 17:24. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, and he settled them in the towns of Samaria in place of the Israelites. Each nation continued to make its own gods and to set them up in the cult places. Each nation set them up in the towns in which it lived. They worshipped Yahweh while serving their own gods. To this day they follow their former practices. They do not worship Yahweh properly. They do not follow the laws and practices, the teaching and instruction, that Yahweh enjoined upon the descendants of Jacob, who was given the name Israel. But they did not obey. They continued their former practices. Those nations worshipped Yahweh, but they also served their idols. To this day their children and their children's children do as their ancestors did." End quote. The modern-day Samaritans have a different view of all that. You probably know the Samaritans from the parable recounted in the Gospel of Luke. They claim to be the descendants of the Israelites left behind when some were carried off to Assyria in the deportation. This claim has some DNA evidence behind it. Judaism has always rejected that claim and shuns the Samaritans. The Samaritans are a small and oppressed community, a few hundred strong. They don't get a good press. I've seen them called pagan half-Jews. That's a terrible thing to say. Their position in Israel is ambiguous and parlous. They are recognised by the state as permitted to live there under the law of return, but regarded by the rabbinical courts as Gentiles. In his inscriptions, the Assyrian king records that he deported the oddly specific figure of 27,290 inhabitants. We cannot know if these were just the adult males, which was the usual meaning of inhabitants, or the entire total. However you figure it, the deportees were only a fraction of the population of the northern kingdom of Israel. The archaeological evidence is that the Assyrians deported the inhabitants of a few major urban centres. They left the vast bulk of the peasantry behind to till the land. Even the Bible grudgingly admits that the northern kingdom was not entirely Gentile. A few years after the destruction of Israel, Hezekiah, king of Judah, asked the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh to journey to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. The prophet Jeremiah reports that Israelites from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria came with offerings to the temple in Jerusalem. I'll have a lot more to say about these matters in the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. King Ahaz of Judah, dead at the age of 36, had left the throne to his 25-year-old son, Hezekiah, his Kiyahu. Wait, what? Ahaz was a father at the age of 11? That seems precocious, even for a king of Judah. Yet again, the reigns of a Judean king can't be reconciled either with the synchronisms that the Bible itself provides with the Israelite kings, nor with Assyrian records. As with all my dates for the kings, I'm following Miller and Hayes and placing Hezekiah's reign at 727 to 699 BC. Check out my website www.historyinthebible.com for more information. Hezekiah gets 5-star treatment in the Bible, the most talked about king since Solomon. 3 whole chapters in 2 Kings and 4 in 2 Chronicles. 3 chapters in Isaiah pretty much duplicate those in Kings. It's possible that those chapters in Isaiah were originally part of 2 Kings and copied to the prophet's book to emphasize Isaiah's role in Hezekiah's reign. In Chronicles, Hezekiah is the greatest king of Judah after David. He symbolizes the reunification of all the Hebrews around the temple, as in the days of David and Solomon. The Book of Kings concentrates on Hezekiah's military adventures, Chronicles on his religious achievements. The king seems to have done quite well for much of his reign. Quote, 2 Chronicles 32:27. Hezekiah enjoyed riches and glory in abundance. He filled treasuries with silver and gold, precious stones, spices and shields, and all lovely objects, and store cities with the produce of grain, wine, and oil, and stalls for all kinds of beasts, and flocks for sheepfolds. And he acquired towns and flocks of small and large cattle in great number. For God endowed him with very many possessions." End quote. Like his father Ahaz, Hezekiah accepted his place in the Assyrian trade system. As a reward for loyal service, he seems to have been awarded oversight of the coastal strip occupied by the Philistines. This is the last time that the Bible mentions the Philistines, who now disappear from history. At last, the ancient enemy of the Judeans, who had vexed them since the time of the Judges, 4 centuries earlier, were gone. When describing the conquest of Canaan, the book of Joshua had allocated the Philistine territories to the tribe of Judah. Hezekiah's reign was the only time in the history of Judah that the kingdom actually controlled the coast and had access to the Mediterranean Sea. This gives us a good reason for thinking that the book of Joshua was written in Hezekiah's reign, or shortly after. Hezekiah faced 3 great crises in his reign, all thanks to the Assyrians. The first crisis, early in the king's rule, was that of the Assyrian destruction of the kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. Refugees flooded south. Some of those refugees were scribes of the Deuteronomistic school, members of the Yahweh-only party of the prophets Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, bringing with them the histories of Israel. Other scribes brought stories of the patriarchs, stories we now call the e-source that runs through the books from Genesis through Numbers. If you want a refresher on the e-source, check out episode 1.7. The archaeological evidence is that Judah and Jerusalem exploded in size in the decades after the fall of Israel. Judah expanded from perhaps 25,000 to perhaps 120,000 people. Jerusalem transformed from a village of about 1,000 to a decent town of 10 or 15,000. The Judeans were now a minority in their own land. This, say modernist archaeologists, is the time that Judah became a centralized state, a real kingdom. Not in 1000 BC with King David, but after 720 BC in the time of King Hezekiah. I'm with the modernists. No one has been able to dig up any evidence from the dry earth that Judah could be called a fully functioning state before Hezekiah. There are no scribal tablets, no securely datable building works, no evidence that Judah was anything but Israel's rural hinterland. The Israelite scribes were the first to introduce literacy to Judah. As monarch of the last remaining Hebrew kingdom, Hezekiah wanted the Israelite refugees to integrate themselves with his own Judeans. His kingdom was next on the Assyrian hit list. He had to fill his small state with as many nationalists as possible, even if most were illegal refugees. The king had to convince the immigrants of the truth of the royal Zion ideology, an ideology the northern Israelites had rejected 200 years before. He had to persuade his new subjects that God had given a monopoly of the rule over the Hebrews to the house of David, and that the headquarters of this monopoly was the inviolable royal city of Jerusalem, the city of God. Hezekiah launched into a series of religious reforms. Kings mentions them in 3 verses. Chronicles describes them in as many chapters. Hezekiah reacted to strengthen the authority of his government. He banned the clan-based countryside shrines and the ancient Israelite shrine at Bethel to strengthen his central authority. He embarked on sweeping religious reforms. He was the first to remove the high places, open-air altars, which had never been disturbed by even the most righteous kings such as Solomon. The religious reformation of Hezekiah was not a Puritan enthusiasm, but a carefully calculated political program. The Israelite refugee scribes fitted nicely into that plan. Unlike the peasants running south, they were ardent Yahwists. They had the smarts and the literacy to create a narrative that would unite the Israelites and the Judeans, who had previously been bitter enemies. They fabricated a history and a theology that depicted the two kingdoms as two parts of a sundered whole. They were the Deuteronomists. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I continue the story of Hezekiah, his religious reforms, and the other crises of his reign. I'll see you then.